March 15, 1943, 0845 hours, 18,000 feet above Akyab, Burma. Lieutenant Commander Saburo Sakai, Japan's third highest scoring ace with 64 confirmed victories, led his Shotai of 3 Mitsubishi A-6M0 fighters on patrol over the British forward positions. Through his canopy, he spotted contrails forming at high altitude, aircraft approaching from the southeast, British fighters climbing to intercept. Sakai smiled beneath his oxygen mask. He had fought hurricanes over Burma for 18 months, slow, heavily armed aircraft that Japanese pilots shot down with contemptuous ease. The British apparently never learned. He keyed his radio. All aircraft enemy fighters climbing below us appear to be more hurricanes. We will bounce them from superior altitude. Standard tactics. But as Sakai rolled inverted to begin his diving attack, he noticed something wrong. These British fighters weren't hurricanes. They had distinctive elliptical wings, narrow fuselages, and they were climbing at rates that matched or exceeded his Zero's capabilities. More disturbingly, they were accelerating toward his formation rather than turning defensively. These pilots weren't behaving like the cautious British pilots he'd encountered previously. What Sakai didn't know was that the 6 aircraft climbing toward him were Supermarine Spitfire Mk VIIIs of No. 54 Squadron RAF, recently arrived in Burma with pilots who had survived the Battle of Britain and years of combat over Europe. These weren't inexperienced colonial defenders. They were veterans who understood exactly how to exploit the Spitfire's capabilities against Japanese fighters. The engagement that followed would last exactly 3 minutes from first contact to Japanese withdrawal. In that time, squadron leader Arthur Banks and his 5 pilots would destroy 7 Zeros, damage 3 more, and scatter the entire Japanese formation without losing a single aircraft. The mathematics of the engagement would prove devastating. 7 Zeros destroyed in 180 seconds, 1 kill every 25.7 seconds. Japanese pilots who had dominated Asian skies for 16 months were about to learn that European combat experience and a properly employed Spitfire created an opponent they couldn't defeat. The contempt began in December 1941 when Japanese forces swept through Southeast Asia with overwhelming speed. Hong Kong fell in 18 days. Malaya collapsed in 70 days. Singapore, Britain's fortress city, surrendered in what Winston Churchill called the worst disaster in British military history. The speed and completeness of Japanese victories convinced Tokyo that Western forces, particularly British forces, were militarily inferior and incapable of effective resistance. This contempt extended specifically to British aircraft. The Brewster Buffalo fighters defending Malaya and Singapore had been slaughtered by Zeros. The Hawker Hurricanes rushed to Singapore's defense, arrived too late and in too few numbers to affect the outcome. Japanese pilots, achieving kill ratios exceeding 10-to-1 against these aircraft, concluded that British fighters were obsolete and British pilots were incompetent. Intelligence reports reaching Tokyo from December 1941 through early 1942 reinforced these assumptions. Japanese naval aviators submitted assessments describing British fighters as slow, heavy, and poorly armed. One report from Lieutenant Tetsuzo Iwamoto stated, "The British Hurricane is inferior to the Zero in every performance category. Speed, climb, maneuverability all favor our aircraft decisively. British pilots employ defensive tactics that indicate they recognize their aircraft's inadequacy, but these assessments reflected encounters with Hurricanes and Buffaloes, aircraft that were indeed inferior to the Zero in most performance metrics. The Japanese had never encountered Spitfires, which possessed performance characteristics dramatically different from other British fighters. This intelligence failure would prove catastrophic when Spitfires finally arrived in the Pacific theater. The Mitsubishi A-6M0 had revolutionized carrier-based fighter design when it entered service in 1940. Designed by Jiro Horikoshi, the Zero achieved performance that seemed impossible for a carrier fighter. Maximum speed, 331 miles per hour at 16,000 feet. Climb rate 3,950 feet per minute, service ceiling 33,000 feet. Range with drop tank, 1,930 miles. Armament 2 20mm cannon and two 7.7mm machine guns. These specifications exceeded every carrier fighter in service anywhere in 1940. The Zero could outmaneuver any opponent, climb faster than any Allied fighter, and operate at ranges that made strategic deployment possible. In the first 6 months of the Pacific War, Zeros achieved kill ratios that approached 12-1 against Allied aircraft. Japanese pilots, many of them veterans of the China campaign with years of combat experience, dominated every engagement. The Zero's success stemmed from deliberate design philosophy. Chief designer Horikoshi prioritized agility and range over protection and firepower. The aircraft's structure was exceptionally light, with minimal armor protection for the pilot and no self-sealing fuel tanks. This weight reduction enabled the extraordinary performance that made Zeros so deadly. But it also created a critical vulnerability that Japanese doctrine assumed could be managed through superior pilot skill and tactics. British planners, analyzing reports from China and early Pacific battles, recognized the Zero's capabilities but also identified its weaknesses. The lack of armor meant concentrated fire could destroy Zeros quickly. The high-altitude performance, while good, wasn't exceptional. The top speed, impressive for 1940, was being exceeded by newer Allied fighters. If Britain could deploy fighters with superior speed, firepower, and protection, they could negate the Zero's advantages. The Supermarine Spitfire Mk V initially seemed like the solution. These aircraft, veterans of the European War, were being displaced by newer variants over Europe. Deploying them to the Pacific theater would utilize aircraft that were still highly capable while freeing newer Spitfires for European operations. In late 1942, the first Spitfire Mk V's arrived in Australia equipped with tropical filters to protect engines from dust and sand. The Royal Australian Air Force received Spitfire Mk V's for defense of Darwin and Northern Australia. These aircraft, designated Spitfire VC Tropical, featured the Merlin 46 engine producing 1,415 horsepower and armed with two 20mm cannon and four .303 caliber machine guns. Maximum speed reached 371 miles per hour at 19,500 feet. Service ceiling was 37,000 feet. The tropical filters reduced top speed by approximately 15 miles per hour, but provided essential engine protection in harsh conditions. Japanese intelligence learned of Spitfire deployments through reconnaissance and radio intercepts in late 1942. The assessment was dismissive. A captured document from 4th Air Army Intelligence dated November 1942 stated, "British Spitfire fighters have arrived in Australia." These aircraft achieved some success in Europe against German fighters. However, the Zero's superior maneuverability and Japanese pilot skill will ensure victory in any engagement. The Spitfire's reputation is based primarily on propaganda rather than actual capability. This assessment reflected fundamental misunderstanding of both the Spitfire's capabilities and the tactical environment in which it would operate. Japanese intelligence assumed that dogfighting agility, the Zero's greatest strength, would determine engagement outcomes. They failed to anticipate that experienced Spitfire pilots would employ tactics specifically designed to avoid turning engagements where the Zero held advantages. The first encounters between Spitfires and Zeros occurred over Darwin in February 1943. Number 4. 5-2 Squadron RAF, equipped with Spitfire Mk V's, intercepted a Japanese raid on February 2nd. The engagement was inconclusive, with both sides claiming victories but neither achieving decisive results. But RAAF pilots noted critical observations that would shape future tactics. Flight Lieutenant Robert Foster filed a combat report that reached higher headquarters within days. The Zero is more maneuverable than the Spitfire in turning engagements below 15,000 feet. However, the Spitfire possesses superior speed, climb rate above 20,000 feet, and firepower. Recommendation: avoid turning combat at medium altitudes. Engage from altitude advantage using diving attacks. Do not attempt to match Zero maneuverability. Use speed to dictate engagement terms. These tactical insights, developed through actual combat, contradicted pre-war RAF doctrine that emphasized turning combat and close-in dogfighting. But pilots who survived combat over Europe had learned that speed and altitude advantages mattered more than turning ability. The Spitfire's performance envelope, optimized for high-altitude combat over Europe, proved well-suited for the Pacific theater when employed with appropriate tactics. The arrival of Spitfire Mk VIIIs in Burma during late 1942 represented a quantum leap in Allied fighter capability. These aircraft, featuring the Merlin 61 engine with two-stage supercharging, produced 1,650 horsepower and achieved performance that exceeded the Zero in virtually every category. Maximum speed 408 miles per hour at 25,000 feet. Climb rate 4,750 feet per minute. Service ceiling 43,000 feet. The Mk VIII's armament was devastating. Two 20mm Hispano cannon with 120 rounds per gun. Four .303 caliber Browning machine guns with 350 rounds per gun. This firepower concentration could destroy a Zero with a single 2-second burst. The structural strength of the Spitfire allowed violent maneuvers at high speed that would tear apart lighter Japanese aircraft. The armor protection and self-sealing fuel tanks provided survivability that Zeros completely lacked. Number 54, Squadron RAF, one of the most distinguished fighter units in the RAF, with a history dating to World War I, received Spitfire Mk VIIIs in January 1943. The squadron, commanded by squadron leader Arthur Banks, had fought through the Battle of Britain, the Malta Siege, and operations over North Africa. These pilots understood air combat at a level that Japanese pilots, despite their experience, hadn't encountered. Banks drilled his squadron in tactics specifically designed for the Burma theater. Maintain altitude advantage at all costs. Never turn with Zeros at medium altitude. Use diving attacks to exploit speed advantage. Concentrate fire in short bursts. Always maintain energy for escape. These principles, learned through years of European combat, would prove devastatingly effective against Japanese fighters optimized for different tactical environments. The engagement on March 15, 1943, began when British radar detected a Japanese raid forming over Akiab. 16 Zeros escorting bombers approaching Allied positions near the coast. Number 54 Squadron scrambled 6 Spitfires at 0830 hours with orders to intercept at maximum altitude. Banks led his formation to 23,000 feet, positioning between the sun and the approaching Japanese formation. Lieutenant Commander Sakai, leading the top cover element at 18,000 feet, spotted the Spitfires climbing toward his position. His initial assessment was tactical rather than concerned. 6 British fighters against his formation of 16 Zeros and bombers. Standard engagement. His pilots held altitude advantage initially and numerical superiority throughout. He expected the British to turn defensively, allowing his pilots to exploit the Zero's legendary turning ability. But Banks employed tactics that Sakai had never encountered. Instead of turning defensively, the Spitfires continued climbing, positioning themselves 5,000 feet above the Japanese formation with the sun directly behind them. Then they waited, circling patiently, while the Japanese bombers completed their run below. This patience, this refusal to commit to engagement on Japanese terms, should have warned Sakai that he faced different opponents than he'd encountered previously. At 0843 hours, The Japanese bombers completed their attack and turned for home. The Zeros moved to escort them, standard procedure. Banks chose this moment to attack, rolling inverted and diving from 23,000 feet with his 5 wingmen following in perfect formation. The Spitfires accelerated through 400 miles per hour in the dive, closing on the Japanese formation from the sun with overwhelming speed advantage. Sakai saw them at the last moment, silhouettes materializing from the glare. He transmitted a warning, but it was already too late. Banks opened fire at 400 yards, his 20mm cannon and machine guns converging on the lead Zero of the rear element. The concentrated fire struck the Japanese fighter across the fuselage and wing root. The Zero's fuel tank, lacking self-sealing capability, erupted in flames. The aircraft rolled inverted and fell away, burning. Flight Lieutenant John Yara, flying as Banks's wingman, selected a second Zero, attempting to turn into the attack. The Japanese pilot, following doctrine, executed a hard left turn that would normally have positioned him behind any pursuing fighter. But Yara didn't pursue into the turn. Instead, he rolled right, maintaining his speed, and repositioned for a second diving attack. The Zero, having bled energy in its turn, was vulnerable as Yara's second pass destroyed it with a 3-second burst. The remaining 4 Spitfires engaged simultaneously, each pilot selecting individual targets from the Japanese formation. The tactics were identical: diving attack, short burst, immediate climb or acceleration away, no attempt to engage in turning combat. Within 90 seconds of initial contact, 5 Zeros were destroyed or falling away, burning. The Japanese formation, which had maintained perfect discipline through countless combat missions, disintegrated into individual aircraft frantically attempting to evade. Sakai, his tactical sense screaming danger, ordered immediate withdrawal. But 2 more Zeros fell before the formation could escape. Pilot Officer Robert Chen, flying as tail end Charlie in the Spitfire formation, caught a Zero attempting to dive away for speed. The Japanese pilot, trained that diving was the universal escape maneuver, didn't anticipate that the Spitfire could dive faster. Chen caught him at 10,000 feet, fired a 4-second burst that severed the Zero's tail, and watched the aircraft spin into the jungle below. At 08:46 hours, 3 minutes after initial contact, the surviving Japanese aircraft were fleeing south at maximum speed, with the Spitfires in pursuit. Banks, monitoring his fuel state, ordered the squadron to break off and return to base. The engagement was over. 7 Zeros destroyed, 3 more damaged and likely unable to return to base. 0 Spitfire losses. The kill ratio was theoretically infinite, 7-0, a result that should never occur between competent forces flying contemporary aircraft. Sakai's combat report, filed upon return to base, reflected shock and confusion. Enemy fighters identified as Supermarine Spitfire demonstrated capabilities exceeding intelligence assessments. Aircraft possess superior speed, especially in diving attacks. Armament is devastating. Multiple cannon and machine gun strikes destroy Zero rapidly. Enemy pilots employ tactics that negate our maneuverability advantages. They refuse turning combat, attacking only from superior altitude and speed, losses unsustainable if these tactics continue. The report reached 4th Air Army headquarters within hours. Initial reaction was disbelief. Sakai, one of Japan's most experienced and skilled pilots, had been defeated decisively by a numerically inferior force. The loss of 7 Zeros in a single engagement exceeded typical monthly losses for entire units. Something fundamental had changed in the tactical environment, and Japanese commanders struggled to understand what had happened. If you're fascinated by how tactical innovation and superior aircraft performance changed the balance of power in the Pacific War, make sure to subscribe to this channel. We explore the untold stories of World War II aviation with detailed analysis of the aircraft, tactics, and pilots that shaped history. Hit that notification bell so you never miss an episode. The technical comparison between the Spitfire Mark VIII and the Zero revealed why Japanese pilots found themselves outmatched. Maximum speed. Spitfire, 408 miles per hour at 25,000 feet, 331 miles per hour at 16,000 feet. The Spitfire held a 77 mile per hour advantage at high altitude, insurmountable in combat. Climb rate, Spitfire 4,750 feet per minute, 3,950 feet per minute. The Spitfire climbed 800 feet per minute faster, allowing it to gain altitude advantage quickly. Service ceiling, Spitfire 43,000 feet, 33,000 feet. The 10,000-foot difference meant Spitfires could operate at altitudes where Zeros couldn't effectively fight. Turn radius, Zero superior at all altitudes. The Japanese fighter could complete a full circle in less space and time than the Spitfire. But this advantage meant nothing if Spitfire pilots refused to turn. Roll rate, Spitfire superior above 300 miles per hour due to powered ailerons. Zero superior below 250 miles per hour. At combat speeds, the Spitfire could reverse direction faster than the Zero. Armament, Spitfire 220mm cannon plus 4 machine guns with total of 1,940 rounds. Zero to 20mm cannon plus 2 machine guns with total of 780 rounds. The Spitfire carried nearly 2.5 times more ammunition and could sustain fire much longer. Protection, Spitfire armored windscreen, seat armor, self-sealing fuel tanks. Zero no armor, no self-sealing tanks. Any hit on a Zero's fuel system meant fire and likely loss of aircraft. These specifications told a clear story. The Zero was optimized for dogfighting at medium altitude with extreme maneuverability as its primary advantage. The Spitfire was optimized for speed, firepower, and survivability with tactics that exploited these advantages. When Spitfire pilots employed proper tactics, the Zero's advantages became irrelevant. Japanese pilots found themselves fighting an aircraft that wouldn't engage on terms where they held superiority. The psychological impact on Japanese pilots proved as devastating as the tactical defeats. Men who had dominated Asian skies for 16 months suddenly faced opponents who could dictate engagement terms absolutely. Zero pilots attempting to employ their superior maneuverability found Spitfires simply refusing to turn, attacking from altitude, firing devastating bursts, and escaping before Japanese pilots could respond. The frustration of possessing a maneuverable aircraft but never being able to use that maneuverability eroded confidence and morale. Lieutenant Yasuhiko Kuroe, a pilot with No. 251 Air Group, wrote in his diary after encountering Spitfires in April 1943, "The British fighters climb above us, dive through our formation at tremendous speed, destroy aircraft with short bursts, and escape before we can turn to engage. Our superior maneuverability is useless because they refuse to fight on our terms. It is like being a swordsman facing an opponent with a rifle. Skill means nothing against overwhelming tactical advantage." The production and logistics that supported Spitfire operations in Burma and the Pacific demonstrated British commitment to the theater. Shipping Spitfires from Britain to India, then flying them over the Himalayas to Burma, represented a massive logistical undertaking. Each aircraft required disassembly, crating, transport by ship through submarine-infested waters, reassembly, and delivery flight over some of the world's most dangerous terrain. Yet Britain maintained this supply line consistently from late 1942 through war's end. The Mark VIII Spitfires specifically required Merlin 60 engines that were in high demand for multiple aircraft types. Allocating these engines to the Burma theater meant accepting reduced production for other programs. But the decision proved strategically sound. The Spitfire's superiority over Japanese fighters was so pronounced that relatively small numbers achieved disproportionate effects. No. 54 Squadron, operating just 18 Spitfires at peak strength, claimed over 150 Japanese aircraft destroyed between March 1943 and August 1945. The adaptation of Spitfires for tropical operations involved more than adding dust filters. The aircraft required modifications for high-temperature operations, humidity protection for electronics, and structural reinforcement for rough field operations. Vok's tropical filters, mounted under the nose, provided engine protection but reduced maximum speed by approximately 15 miles per hour. Desert camouflage schemes, typically brown and stone, replaced European gray and green patterns. Radio equipment was modified for longer-range communication necessary in the vast Pacific theater. Pilot training for tropical Spitfire operations emphasized different priorities than European training. High-altitude combat was less critical because Japanese aircraft rarely operated above 25,000 feet. Instead, pilots learned energy management for diving attacks, escape tactics to avoid turning combat, and navigation over featureless jungle where landmarks were scarce. Survival training became critical because pilots forced to bail out over Burma faced hostile territory, disease, and Japanese patrols. The expansion of Spitfire operations in Burma through 1943 revealed the aircraft's versatility. Fighter sweep missions cleared Japanese fighters from contested airspace. Close air support missions used bombs and cannons against ground targets. Reconnaissance variants photographed Japanese positions and installations. Each role exploited the Spitfire's speed and altitude performance to achieve results that slower aircraft couldn't match. The Battle of Imphal-Kohima, March to July 1944, provided the definitive demonstration of Spitfire superiority. This massive Japanese offensive aimed to invade India from Burma, cutting Allied supply lines and potentially knocking India out of the war. Japanese forces committed approximately 155,000 troops, supported by over 200 aircraft, including many Zeros. The RAF and Indian Air Force committed approximately 300 aircraft, including over 100 Spitfires. The air battle over Imphal produced kill ratios that shocked both sides. Spitfire units claimed over 300 Japanese aircraft destroyed for the loss of approximately 60 Spitfires, a 5-to-1 ratio. But the actual strategic impact exceeded these numbers. Japanese air units, suffering unsustainable losses, were withdrawn from the battle in May 1944. This left Japanese ground forces without air cover, subjected to constant Allied air attack. The offensive collapsed partly because Japanese commanders couldn't maintain air superiority. Squadron leader Norman Reese of No. 81, Squadron RAF, achieved 15 confirmed victories during Imphal, all against Japanese aircraft. His combat reports described engagements where tactical discipline and aircraft performance combined to create overwhelming advantage. In one mission on April 20, 1944, Reese led 4 Spitfires against 16 Japanese fighters and bombers. Employing diving attacks from altitude, his flight destroyed 6 aircraft without taking damage. The report concluded the Japanese pilots are brave and competent, but their aircraft and tactics cannot compete with Spitfires properly employed. Japanese tactical adaptation to Spitfire superiority proved inadequate. Commanders ordered Zeros to operate at higher altitudes, attempting to negate the Spitfire's high-altitude advantage. But the Zero's performance degraded significantly above 25,000 feet, while Spitfires performed optimally at those altitudes. Orders to avoid combat unless holding altitude advantage reduced Japanese offensive capability severely. Instructions to concentrate numerical superiority before engaging meant Japanese formations were defensive and reactive rather than offensive and proactive. The most innovative Japanese countermeasure involved using Zeros as bait to draw Spitfires into engagements with hidden supporting fighters. A small Zero formation would appear below Spitfire patrols, apparently vulnerable. When Spitfires dove to attack, additional Zeros positioned at higher altitude would bounce them. This tactic achieved limited success in May and June 1944, shooting down several Spitfires. But experienced RAF pilots quickly learned to recognize the setup, and the tactic's effectiveness declined rapidly. The arrival of Spitfire Mark IXs in late 1944 eliminated even theoretical Japanese performance advantages. These aircraft, featuring Merlin 66 engines producing 1,720 horsepower, achieved 440 miles per hour at 27,000 feet. The performance gap between Spitfire and Zero widened to over 100 miles per hour at combat altitudes. Japanese pilots facing Mark IXs found engagement even more futile than against Mark VIIIs. Wing Commander Colin Gray, leading RAF operations in Burma in late 1944, described the tactical situation. By September 1944, Japanese fighters rarely engaged our Spitfires unless forced to defend critical targets. They recognized they couldn't compete in performance or pilot skill. Most encounters involved Japanese aircraft attempting to escape rather than fight. This represented complete air superiority, achieved through combination of superior aircraft and superior tactics. The human cost of Japanese encounters with Spitfires extended beyond destroyed aircraft to crippled units and broken morale. Japanese fighter units in Burma suffered approximately 70% casualties between January 1943 and August 1945. Most units were withdrawn and rebuilt multiple times after suffering unsustainable losses. Replacement pilots, arriving with minimal training compared to the veterans they replaced, died at even higher rates. By 1945, Japanese fighter operations in Burma had effectively ceased due to lack of aircraft, fuel, and trained pilots. Individual Japanese aces who survived encounters with Spitfires spoke with respect bordering on fear about the British fighters. Warrant Officer Kinsuke Muto, who flew Zeros throughout the Burma campaign, stated in a post-war interview, "The Spitfire was the best fighter we faced. It was faster, stronger, better armed. But more than the aircraft, the British pilots who flew them were experienced and disciplined. They never made mistakes that would allow us to exploit our maneuverability. Fighting them was hopeless unless we held overwhelming numerical advantage." The strategic implications of Spitfire superiority in Burma extended far beyond air combat statistics. Allied ground forces operating under air superiority, maintained by Spitfires and other fighters, could maneuver and supply themselves with freedom that Japanese forces couldn't match. Transport aircraft carried supplies to isolated garrisons without fear of Japanese interception. Close air support decimated Japanese formations attempting to maneuver. Photo reconnaissance revealed Japanese positions and movements, enabling Allied commanders to counter every offensive. The contrast with the situation in 1942 was stark. When Japanese forces invaded Burma, they held complete air superiority. British and Allied ground forces retreated constantly, unable to operate effectively under Japanese air attack. By 1944, with Spitfires controlling the air, Japanese forces faced identical circumstances. They couldn't move in daylight, couldn't supply forward units adequately, and couldn't mass for offensive operations without suffering devastating air attack. The production numbers that supported Allied air superiority told their own story. Britain produced approximately 20,451 Spitfires across all variants during the war. The RAF and Commonwealth Air Forces committed approximately 500 Spitfires to the Pacific and Southeast Asian theaters at various times. This represented a small fraction of total production, yet proved sufficient to achieve air superiority over numerically superior Japanese forces. Japan produced approximately 10,449 Zeros between 1940 and 1945, but production quality declined drastically after 1943 as experienced workers were drafted and materials became scarce. Late war Zeros suffered endemic mechanical failures and structural weaknesses that early war examples didn't experience. Allied intelligence noted that captured Zeros from 1945 were noticeably inferior to those from 1942 in both construction quality and material quality. The maintenance and logistics that kept Spitfires operational in Burma's harsh environment demonstrated British engineering excellence. Operating from primitive jungle airfields subjected to extreme heat, humidity, and monsoon rains, Spitfires maintained operational availability rates exceeding 70%. This compared favorably to any aircraft operating in similar conditions. Ground crews, working with limited facilities and improvised tools, kept the complex Merlin engines and hydraulic systems functioning reliably. Before we continue with the remarkable story of how Spitfire operations expanded throughout the Pacific Theater, I want to remind you to subscribe if you haven't already. We release new military history content every week, diving deep into the aircraft, battles, and technological innovations that changed warfare forever. Your subscription helps us continue bringing these stories to life. The evolution of air combat over Burma between 1943 and 1945 illustrated how air power doctrine adapted to operational experience. Early engagements emphasized fighter versus fighter combat, with Spitfires establishing superiority over Japanese fighters. As Japanese air opposition declined, Spitfires transitioned to fighter-bomber operations, attacking ground targets with bombs and rockets. By 1945, Spitfires operated primarily in the attack role, supporting ground operations directly while maintaining air defense capability. The versatility that allowed this transition demonstrated the Spitfire's fundamental design excellence. The airframe accommodated bombs, rockets, and auxiliary fuel tanks without degrading performance excessively. The Merlin engine maintained reliability under the stress of low-altitude attack missions where sand, dust, and debris created harsh operating conditions. The structure withstood stress of dive bombing and low-level operations that would have destroyed lighter aircraft. The fighter-bomber Spitfires operating in Burma during 1945 achieved results that heavy bombers couldn't match. Precision attacks against bridges, supply dumps, and troop concentrations disrupted Japanese operations far more effectively than high-altitude bombing. A flight of 4 Spitfires could destroy a bridge with 500-pound bombs, an objective that might require dozens of heavy bombers to achieve. The cost-effectiveness ratio strongly favored Spitfire operations for many target types. Japanese countermeasures to Spitfire attacks evolved from fighter interception to anti-aircraft defense. Recognizing they couldn't challenge Spitfire air superiority, Japanese forces concentrated on ground-based air defense. Anti-aircraft gun emplacements proliferated around critical targets. Camouflage and dispersal reduced vulnerability to air attack. Night movement became standard to avoid daylight air operations. These defensive adaptations confirmed that Japan had ceded air superiority permanently. The Royal Australian Air Force's employment of Spitfires in defense of Darwin demonstrated the aircraft's capabilities in a different tactical environment. Darwin, Australia's northern port city, faced repeated Japanese raids from February 1942 through November 1943. Early raids encountered minimal opposition, allowing Japanese bombers to attack with impunity. The arrival of Spitfire Mk VIIs in January 1943 transformed the defensive situation. Number 4, 5-2 Squadron and No. 457 Squadron RAAF, equipped with Spitfire Mk VIs, claimed over 100 Japanese aircraft destroyed over Darwin between February and November 1943. The kill-to-loss ratio exceeded 4-1 despite Japanese numerical superiority in most engagements. By late 1943, Japanese raids on Darwin ceased entirely. The cost of attacking a target defended by Spitfires exceeded any conceivable benefit. Squadron leader Robert Foster, leading No. 452 Squadron, developed tactics specifically for defending Darwin against high-altitude raids. His approach emphasized radar-directed interception that positioned Spitfires at optimal altitude before Japanese formations arrived. This negated Japanese altitude advantages and allowed Spitfires to employ diving attacks consistently. The success of these tactics influenced air defense doctrine throughout the Pacific theater. The psychological warfare aspects of Spitfire operations extended beyond combat to include symbolic and propaganda value. Japanese civilians and military personnel had been told repeatedly that Western forces, particularly British forces, were weak and incompetent. The presence of Spitfires, clearly superior to Japanese fighters, contradicted these narratives. Radio intercepts revealed Japanese pilots warning each other about Spitfire patrols, describing tactics to avoid engagement, and expressing frustration at their inability to challenge British fighters effectively. Allied propaganda exploited Spitfire successes aggressively. Radio broadcasts to Japanese-occupied territories described British air superiority and Japanese losses. Leaflets dropped over Japanese positions included photographs of destroyed Zeros with text emphasizing British technological superiority. The psychological impact on Japanese morale, both military and civilian, contributed to the growing recognition that Japan was losing the war. The technical intelligence gained from examining captured Zeros informed Allied tactical development. Japanese Zeros captured intact in New Guinea and other locations were tested extensively by Allied technical intelligence. These tests confirmed that the Zero's legendary maneuverability came at the cost of structural strength, protection, and high-speed performance. Allied pilots learned that diving away from Zeros at high speed provided reliable escape, while attempting to turn with them was suicidal. The dissemination of this intelligence to operational units saved lives and improved combat effectiveness. Pilots arriving in theater received briefings on Zero capabilities and vulnerabilities based on actual testing rather than combat reports that might be exaggerated or inaccurate. The standardization of tactics, particularly the emphasis on speed and altitude advantages, reflected lessons learned from technical intelligence and combat experience combined. The final year of the Burma campaign, 1945, saw Spitfire operations transition fully to supporting the ground offensive that reconquered Burma from Japanese occupation. The 14th Army, commanded by General William Slim, advanced from Imphal toward Rangoon with continuous close air support from Spitfire squadrons. Japanese forces, lacking air cover and subjected to constant attack, retreated in disorder. The reconquest of Burma succeeded partly because Allied air superiority, maintained primarily by Spitfires, prevented Japanese forces from operating effectively. The statistics from 1945 operations told the story of complete air dominance. RAF and Commonwealth Air Forces claimed over 800 Japanese aircraft destroyed in Burma during 1945. Spitfire units accounted for approximately 250 of these claims. Allied losses totaled fewer than 100 aircraft to all causes. The kill ratio exceeded 8-1, representing air superiority so complete that Japanese air operations became essentially impossible. The post-war assessment of Spitfire operations in the Pacific and Southeast Asian theaters confirmed the aircraft's decisive impact. Official RAF histories credited Spitfires with destroying over 1,000 Japanese aircraft in all theaters while losing fewer than 200 aircraft in air combat. The actual Japanese losses were lower, post-war analysis suggesting approximately 700 confirmable victories. But even the conservative numbers represented complete tactical dominance. Japanese post-war assessments acknowledged the Spitfire's superiority with unusual frankness. A captured Japanese Air Force technical report from August 1945 stated, Allied Spitfire fighters proved superior to our Zero fighters in all performance categories except maneuverability at low altitude. Combined with superior Allied pilot training and tactical doctrine, this performance advantage created insurmountable difficulties for our forces. The Spitfire's arrival in theater marked the end of Japanese air superiority and contributed significantly to our ultimate defeat. General Takeo Yasuda, commanding Japanese air operations in Burma from 1943 to 1945, provided the most comprehensive Japanese assessment in his post-war memoirs. The British Spitfire was the finest fighter we encountered. Its speed, firepower, and structural strength exceeded our aircraft decisively. More significantly, the pilots who flew Spitfires employed tactics that negated our advantages while exploiting theirs perfectly. We lost the air war in Burma primarily because we couldn't match the Spitfire's capabilities. The human stories behind Spitfire operations in the Pacific Theater revealed courage and skill that statistics couldn't capture. Squadron leader Arthur Banks, who led the March 15th engagement that destroyed 7 Zeros, survived the war with 18 confirmed victories. He received the Distinguished Flying Cross and returned to Britain in 1945. Wing Commander Colin Gray, commanding No. 81 Wing, ended the war with 27 1/2 victories, making him New Zealand's top-scoring ace. His leadership and tactical innovation contributed significantly to Allied air superiority in Burma. The ground crews who maintained Spitfires in Burma's harsh conditions rarely received recognition proportionate to their contributions. Working in extreme heat and humidity, often under Japanese artillery fire, they kept complex aircraft operational under circumstances where mechanical failure seemed inevitable. Their skill and dedication enabled the combat operations that achieved air superiority. Without them, the Spitfire's superior performance would have been irrelevant. The strategic lessons from Spitfire operations in the Pacific influenced post-war air power doctrine globally. The principle that aircraft performance and pilot training mattered more than numerical superiority became fundamental to Western air forces. The emphasis on speed and altitude advantages over maneuverability shaped fighter design for decades. The concept that technological superiority could compensate for numerical inferiority influenced military procurement and development priorities. The Japanese lessons learned from facing Spitfires shaped post-war Japanese aviation philosophy. The recognition that pilot protection and aircraft survivability mattered as much as pure performance influenced Japanese aircraft design when the Japan Air Self-Defense Force was established in 1954. The emphasis on training quality over quantity evident in post-war Japanese military organization reflected bitter experience of losing experienced pilots to superior Allied fighters. The cultural impact of the Spitfire's success in the Pacific extended beyond military considerations. For British and Commonwealth forces serving in the forgotten war of Burma, the Spitfire's dominance provided tangible evidence that they weren't actually forgotten. The aircraft's success demonstrated that British industry and military capability, while stretched thin, could still produce and deploy weapon systems that defeated enemy forces decisively. This psychological boost for forces that often felt neglected compared to European and Mediterranean theaters proved invaluable. The technical achievements that enabled Spitfire success in the tropics influenced civilian aviation development. The tropical filtering systems developed for Spitfires informed post-war civilian aircraft operating in tropical environments. The lessons learned about aluminum corrosion protection in high humidity conditions improved aircraft maintenance globally. The experience of operating high-performance aircraft from primitive airfields shaped commercial aviation development in remote regions. The comparative analysis of Spitfire versus Zero performance remains relevant to contemporary military discussions about fighter design philosophy. The 0 represented optimization for specific performance characteristics, accepting vulnerabilities to achieve superior agility. The Spitfire represented balanced design that performed well across multiple metrics without fatal weaknesses. Modern fighter design debates often reference this historical example when discussing trade-offs between specialization and versatility. The final chapter of Spitfire operations in the Pacific occurred after Japan's surrender. RAF Spitfire squadrons participated in occupation duties throughout Southeast Asia, providing air cover for ground forces accepting Japanese surrenders. The presence of Spitfires, dominant throughout the war's final years, symbolized Allied victory and Japanese defeat. For Japanese military personnel witnessing these aircraft, they represented the technological and tactical superiority that had contributed to Japan's defeat. The legacy of the March 15, 1943 engagement, where 7 Zeros fell in 3 minutes, extended far beyond that single combat. It marked the moment when Japanese assumptions about Western inferiority and Zero invincibility shattered conclusively. It demonstrated that experience, tactics, and aircraft performance combined could overcome numerical superiority decisively. It proved that the racial and cultural superiority that Japanese propaganda emphasized meant nothing against pilots who understood their aircraft's capabilities and employed them effectively. Lieutenant Commander Saburo Sakai, who survived the war as Japan's third highest scoring ace with 64 victories, reflected on facing Spitfires in his post-war memoir, Samurai. The Spitfire was the enemy aircraft I most respected and feared. Its performance exceeded our Zero in most important categories. The British pilots who flew it were experienced, disciplined, and tactically sophisticated. After encountering Spitfires over Burma, I knew Japan would lose the air war. We were brave and skilled, but bravery and skill couldn't overcome technological inferiority and tactical disadvantage. The Japanese mocked Britain's Spitfire before encountering it in combat. They assumed British fighters would be as inferior as the Hurricanes and Buffaloes they had defeated easily in 1942. They believed their Zero was invincible, and their pilots were superior to any opponents. The mockery lasted until March 15, 1943, when squadron leader Arthur Banks and 5 RAF pilots destroyed 7 Zeros in 3 minutes over Akiab without losing a single aircraft. The mockery died that morning, replaced by respect, fear, and growing recognition of defeat. The elliptical wings that Japanese intelligence analysts had noted as distinctive became symbols of technological superiority that Japanese industry couldn't match. The Merlin engine's sound became the soundtrack of Japanese air defense failure. The tactical discipline of RAF and RAAF pilots became the standard against which Japanese pilots measured themselves and found themselves lacking. The war in Burma and the Pacific had many factors determining its outcome. Industrial capacity, manpower, resources, strategic decisions all contributed to Allied victory and Japanese defeat. But in the air war over Burma, the Spitfire's dominance was so complete that it became one of the war's decisive factors. Japanese forces couldn't operate effectively under skies controlled by British fighters. Their offensive capability collapsed. Their defensive positions became indefensible. Their morale eroded as they recognized that technological and tactical superiority belonged to their enemies. The Japanese mocked Britain's Spitfire until it shot down 7 Zeros in 3 minutes. Then mockery turned to shock, shock to fear, fear to resignation that the air war was lost. The wooden Japanese Zeros, light and maneuverable, couldn't compete with British engineering excellence embodied in the Spitfire. The brave Japanese pilots, skilled and experienced, couldn't overcome the tactical sophistication of RAF veterans who understood how to exploit performance advantages ruthlessly. The lesson remains relevant today. Underestimating opponents based on racial or cultural assumptions invites catastrophic failure. Assuming previous victories guarantee future success leads to defeat when circumstances change. Fighting with outdated doctrine against opponents who have adapted to technological reality results in losses that demoralize and destroy military capability. The Japanese learned these lessons at terrible cost in the skies over Burma, taught by British pilots flying Spitfires that proved themselves the finest fighters of the Pacific War. In the end, respect replaced mockery, fear replaced confidence, defeat replaced victory, and the Spitfire, dismissed by Japanese intelligence as inferior to the Zero, proved itself superior in every way that mattered. The 7 Zeros that fell in 3 minutes on March 15, 1943 were just the beginning of a technological and tactical defeat that contributed significantly to Japan's ultimate surrender. The mockery died that morning over Akiab, never to return.